All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to the second lecture in the spring lecture series of the Society for Catholic Liturgy. My name is Mary Catherine Levry. I'm the secretary of the Society, and it's so good to have you all with us here today. I'm going to ask Tim O'Malley, our Vice President and Treasurer, to introduce our lecture today. So thank you, Tim.
Hello, welcome everyone. It's a joy to have you here and to introduce a dear colleague of the Society and a friend for a long time, Dr. Michon Matthiesen. We knew each other at Boston College many years ago. We had conversations, in fact, in one of the pleasant offices they built after they had terrible offices. I remember that was the first time we had a wonderful conversation with one another. We had the conversation about the work that we're gathered here today to speak about. So Dr. Michon Matthiesen is an associate professor at the University of Mary in North Dakota, where having previously taught at institutions including Providence College, Loyola Marymount, and St. Patrick's Seminary and University in Northern California. Though rooted in the thought of St. Thomas, she reads a number of theologians in the early 20th century who retrieved the thought of the early church fathers and, of course, St. Thomas. Her interest in literature led her to liturgical and sacramental theology, and that led to her dissertation and later her book through CUA Press, Sacrifice as Gift, Eucharist, Grace, and Contemplative Prayer, and Maurice de la Taille. And so that is, in fact, what we're welcoming Dr. Matthiesen to talk about today, about this work, and we welcome her to this spring lecture series precisely on the themes of her book, Is Sacrifice Still Relevant or Possible in the Eucharist Today? Dr. Michon.
Thank you, and I wanted to thank the board for giving me this opportunity to revisit the material I published on Maurice de la Taille. It was enriching for me, and as I thought about this presentation, the question I wanted to foreground was whether or not de la Taille and his thought is still significant today. When I began my work on him back in 2005, which sounds like a long time ago to me now, I was certain that his thought mattered a great deal and was extremely excited to have discovered him. At that time, there was in academic theological circles a certain resistance to sacrifice and a very strong preference for using categories of gift rather than sacrifice when speaking of the Eucharist. And I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Louis-Marie Chauvet and that of Robert Taille, both of whom rely a good deal on the thought of René Girard. Robert Taille published his definitive work on Eucharist and sacrifice in 2009, a book entitled Sacrifice Unveiled, in which he claims that efforts like Maurice de la Taille's make a massive methodological mistake by beginning with the notion of ritual sacrifice that comes from Judaism and a history of religions approach. So I continue to use de la Taille's theology every few years when I teach my Eucharist course. And the fact that the students seem to be taken by it tells me that there is much fruit yet to be consumed by introducing de la Taille to this generation of students, even if my book has not become a bestseller, alas, right? But I do think it's a good point now to reassess the value of de la Taille's work. To begin with, our ecclesial context is certainly different. It's altered over the past 15 years. I think it's fair to say that the Catholic Church in America, but also elsewhere, has become more divisive than it was 10 years ago along liturgical lines, doctrinal lines, and the vision of the church, etc. Secondly, and perhaps I'd like to invite others to think with me about this, but it seems to me that the anti-sacrifice theological voices have waned, quieted a bit in the past several years. People are still reading Chauvet and Taille, but I sense a sort of a diminishment of enthusiasm for their positions. Maybe that would be something we could talk about at the end of this lecture. And then thirdly, just to anticipate somewhat, right, I clearly do think that de la Taille's thought on the Eucharist still speaks in important ways in this third decade of the 21st century. And that in some ways it's been the pandemic which has made some of these ways even more evident to me. So I'm going to try to share with you the outline of my presentation. If this works for me here. What I'm hoping to do is to focus on sort of three categories of de la Taille's thought. The first one, his methodology. The second, his thought on the sacrifice of the Mass. And I'll have another outline for that. I think that Tim O'Malley is going to put it up in the chat for you as well. And then also his robust vision of Eucharistic grace, and in particular, his very invigorating notion of baptismal liturgical theology and spirituality. Okay, so to begin, I want to make some biographical notes about de la Taille, in case some of you aren't familiar with him, and the writing of Mysterium Fidei, which came out in 1921. De la Taille came from a very large family of 11 boys, and very early in his life was interested in the priesthood and attracted to the Jesuits. His formation in that order took place both in France and on English soil because of secularist laws in France that were repeatedly forcing the Jesuits out of the country. So St. Mary's in Canterbury was the primary location where he and his confreres were educated. But also, and this is important, because of his poor health, he spent some time at a Benedictine monastery in England, that of Ramsgate. And while he was there, he came to have a really deep appreciation for the liturgy. And there are stories that he would always volunteer to celebrate the later Sunday Mass simply for the joy of celebrating solemnly. And this connection to the Benedictines would remain strong throughout his life. However, it's somewhat ironic, I think it's ironic at least, that it was a Benedictine, Abbot Vonier, who would reject de la Taille's theology of Eucharistic sacrifice in Vonier's well-known work, A Key to the Doctrine of the Eucharist, which came out in 1924. De la Taille tells us that it was his study of the letter to the Hebrews that engendered the project which would take him 10 years to write. He began it in 1905 and finished in 1915, just before he went off to serve as a chaplain in World War I. The book, again, would be published in 1921 after the war. The full title of it is The Mystery of Faith Concerning the Most August Sacrifice and Sacrament of the Body and Blood of Christ, 50 Elucidations in 3 distinct books. It's quite a tome for any of you who haven't seen it. So when de la Taille returned from the war in 1919, he gave the manuscript to publishers, and he did so, he tells us, speculating that it would only sell perhaps a dozen copies around Europe. And as it happened, within 6 years after the first edition, some 3,000 copies of the book had been sold. And when a third edition came out in 1931, it's likely that no one was as shocked as de la Taille himself. After the war, just to let you know, he was also invited to teach at the Angelicum in Rome, where he stayed until 1930, when his health began to fail and he left teaching. He is said to have had a very challenging and oratorical style in his teaching, and that his lectures on the theology and philosophy of Thomas Aquinas drew crowds of over 200 people. He died in 1933 at the young age of 61. It's to his methodology in the writing of Mysterium Fidei that I wish to spend some time speaking with you about. I propose in my book and elsewhere that de la Taille's work is important both for the stirrings of the liturgical movement in Europe and also for standing as an incipient marker for the early years of Ressourcement and Nouvelle Théologie. Both of these claims, I think, are manifest in the way that de la Taille writes Mysterium Fidei. I can remember fondly the day that I stood in the library stacks at Boston College and pulled volume 1 of Mysterium Fidei off the shelf. I opened it to browse the table of contents and the preface and was immediately drawn in by what he wrote about his vision of theology. As a grad student, I had been reflecting a good deal about the vocation of a theologian, and I found de la Taille's words extremely refreshing. I'm going to share some of those with you. A theologian, he wrote, aims not to dispute, but to illuminate, not to display his own erudition or to promote his own special findings, but rather to augment the knowledge of faith, deepening the engagement of believers with the mysteries of Christ and the Church. More bluntly, he says, theology, quote, has no place for anything that does not foster piety, close quote. So in a word, for de la Taille, theology is to serve the life of the Church, massaging into fuller life the faith of the baptized and exciting desire for God. All of this struck me as so refreshing, especially in an academic setting where success as a theologian seemed precisely to depend on novelty, and with a high value also placed on a certain aggressiveness in writing against one's theological opponents. Also in the preface, de la Taille assures the reader that he is not advancing any new theory of sacrifice. Rather, his desire is to provide a full account of Eucharistic sacrifice by listening deeply to the sources of revelation and tradition, recording them, coordinating them, and refining them, and setting them down for the reader. Scripture and patristic authors are most prominent in de la Taille's collection, the fathers both of the West and of the East, and in retrieving Eastern fathers, I suspect that de la Taille is following in the footsteps of Matthiesen, who began to do this at the end of the 19th century. De la Taille knows he's doing something bold, and he gives a defense for retrieving Eastern voices by suggesting that it is commendable according to the phrase of Moses, "Oh, that all the people might prophesy, provided, as St. Paul says, Christ is announced." The scope of the tradition that de la Taille includes is astonishing. He consults and collects for his readers the testimony of the Church's liturgies, attending to anaphora, collects, prayers over the gifts, post-communion prayers, hymns, right? And all of this might not sound too terribly remarkable to us who have been privileged to learn from liturgical theologians like Aidan Kavanagh and Alexander Schmemann and David Fagerberg about liturgy as theologia prima, but at this time it was something new. De la Taille also collects the witness of Thomas Aquinas and his often conflicting commentators, the writings of both medieval and contemporary theologians, the writings of mystical writers, and both ancient and contemporary preaching, as well as conciliar documents and church catechisms. It's quite a huge catch in his net of tradition. On another level, for de la Taille expresses a clear hierarchy in the sources that he uses. He also displays intellectual generosity towards studies in the field of history of religions, especially works dealing with sacrifice and gift. I suggested earlier that de la Taille is a kind of proto-new theologian out ahead of the Nouvelle Théologie thinkers that would emerge about the time of his death. However, he's also unlike them because many that came to be associated with Nouvelle Théologie dismissed scholasticism tout court as an outdated mode of doing theology. De la Taille does not, right? He does reject a purely philosophical approach to Thomas, an approach which was keen to establish a grand system of Thomas Aquinas' thought. De la Taille favored a reading of Thomas that took seriously the vitality of Thomas's thought, extolling the way it spoke meaningfully to the very real encounter of God's creation and redemption in the historical, liturgical, and spiritual life of human beings. So he has a distaste not for Thomas, but for a rigid neo-Thomism. After the publication of his book, many took note of his new methodology. Lambert Baudouin, who's considered by many to be the father of the liturgical movement, recognized that even the very title of the book, The Mystery of Faith, is a new point of departure for doing theology. Baudouin wrote that it announces a new spirit, a new program of doing theology, one that values mystery and the sacraments of faith, and one that acknowledges that liturgy has a prominent place at the theological table. Karl Rahner would later praise both de la Taille and de Lubac for their art of reading historical texts, not co-opting them according to one's own agenda, but listening to them with integrity and presenting them as having something worthwhile and illuminating to say to our contemporary situation. In 1971, a Jesuit, Julio Jimenez, writing on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Mysterium Fidei, wrote that the work was a guide and teacher for many theologians in the first half of the century, and that it was a catalyst of a liturgical movement and an important factor in the blossoming of liturgical studies. And for him, de la Taille was a precursor to the Second Vatican Council. Just more briefly, de la Taille did have his detractors, primarily some Dominicans. The most notable one was Vincent McNabb, who did not appreciate de la Taille's reading of Thomas on Eucharistic sacrifice. And de la Taille would spend a good deal of effort trying to respond to the Dominicans. I think he did so successfully. You can spend time in the journals looking up this back and forth between them if you are so interested. But what I want to conclude here about what we can learn from de la Taille in terms of his methodology in doing theology is this, right? He teaches us not to bracket off a particular aspect of the theological tradition, even if it has been used in unfortunate or less than salient ways. We saw that he does not reject Thomas Aquinas' work, even though it led some to an ahistorical neo-Thomism, which he found misguided. Nor does he reject some of the findings of anthropological studies or history of religion studies simply because they have led some to atheistic positions or to a theological relativism. So in other words, he teaches us to listen deeply to the fullness of tradition, to not get stuck in just reading and working from a particular moment in the church's history of theology. He tells us also not to fear to look into treasures of the Egyptians, secular works, to retrieve what proves illuminating to the faith. I think this is particularly important, not only in this time of the church, but I believe it's important for many of the students that I teach here at UMary, who often arrive with minds narrowly formed, minds suspicious of anything that might not be theologically safe or that might have some sort of polluting influence on their minds. I mean, don't misunderstand me. I love my students here, their seriousness and their gravity, but they can also at times lack an intellectual freedom and creativity. And I think sometimes also, right, we grown-up theologians need to continually fight the temptation to become entrenched in only one particular theological perspective. So I think de la Taille helps us just in the very reading of it to broaden our understanding of how theology can be done and done well. Okay, I'd like to move on now to what de la Taille is best known for, namely his teaching on Eucharistic sacrifice. And I've tried to distill that teaching in 8 points for you. Let me figure out how to bring that new document up. Tim, did you put it up in the chat room for people? Maybe I could just leave this one up for now then.
I have put it up in the chat room.
Okay, great. I'll just leave this one up then. All right. So a synthesis of de la Taille in 8 points. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but with some commentary as we go through each one. So de la Taille begins in volume 1, thinking about human beings and how by their very nature, as dependent creatures, they are required to offer sacrifice. This obligation is a liturgic obligation, suggesting praise, honor, and recognition of God as the source of all good things and as the highest good. It's a kind of sacrifice in which man willingly surrenders himself, his will, his desires to an all-good creator who attracts his creatures simply by being God, a God who is love. This obligation to offer sacrifice, however, is also propitiatory because human beings are sinful and distant from God. Thus, sacrifice needs to bear a note of sorrow and a desire to bridge the gap between one's own impurity and infidelity and an all-holy and ever faithful God. So these two obligations necessarily overlap in the state of fallen humanity. Man hands himself over to God in praise, thanksgiving, and love, but also with a sense of remorse and the need for expiation. This propitiatory aspect of sacrifice is easier to grasp when de la Taille speaks in terms of sacrifice as gift giving, which is to say, authentic gift giving calls for goodwill and friendship. So if we come before God to offer gifts and sacrifice without acknowledging sorrow for sin, the gift would be offered in an unworthy and unfriendly manner. So de la Taille wants us to see that the element of propitiation, which acknowledges the holiness and the excellence of God, right, properly falls within latria, the other aspect of sacrifice. Okay, more explicitly in the second point, the categories of sacrifice and gift are brought together, right? They coalesce. Rather than being held as if they were on sort of opposite poles, as Luther did, right? Luther said that, right, the Eucharist could only be a gift and not a sacrifice. De la Taille wants to bring sacrifice and gift back together. So sacrifice, he writes, belongs to the category of gift and must involve a sensible exterior rite which demonstrates the handing over of something into the possession of the divine. This external offering requires a socially recognized liturgus, a priest, to perform this ritual handing over, a rite which makes sacred the victim or gift by transferring it into the hands of God. More, and this is important, right? This external act of gift giving is a sign of the interior devotion of the offerer, the one offering. This last point, as you will see, becomes especially important in de la Taille's theory because both the soul and the body share in the fallen condition. So an external sign of latria is necessary. The love and submission of the interior will is both signified and actualized in the gift being handed over to God. To put this in sacramental language, the giving over of the gift is the res et sacramentum of the sacrifice, but the res tantum, the reality itself, is found in the interior offering. Before going on to the third point, from the Council of Trent and to the time of de la Taille's writing, some 350 years, theologians had been wrestling with how to explicate Trent's avowal that the Mass is a true and proper sacrifice. This is from session 22 of Trent. There was a whole group of theologians in the 17th and 18th centuries whom we in later generations have come to call immolationists, precisely because they developed theories of sacrifice looking for immolation in the Mass. They focused on finding in the Mass a destruction or change in the victim being offered. For that is, so they thought, what will give us a true and proper sacrifice. And these theologians are not theologians of ill repute, but respected cardinals like Robert Bellarmine, Cardinal de Lugo, Cardinal Franzelin, and various immolation theories like these continued into the 20th century, which is why de la Taille's own work created something of a stir and controversy in the 1920s when it was published, because it marks a real departure from that current immolational thought. So what are some of these immolational theories? Well, for example, Cardinal Bellarmine argued that the necessary component in sacrificial immolation is found in the priest's consumption of the Eucharistic species, so that the actual consumption of the bread, now body, and wine, now blood, could be said to be the destruction or immolation of the victim. There were more nuanced positions than that one, but each of them in some way gave a grave problem in conceiving of somehow a new state of victimhood in Christ, which de la Taille, and I think he's right here, it says is contrary to Christian piety and makes little sense theologically of a Christ now glorified and at the right hand of God. So a good deal of theological entanglement over sacrifice has occurred, largely due to the failure to carefully distinguish between offering or oblation and immolation. De la Taille argues that the two aspects of sacrifice are integral to each other, and one of them alone cannot encompass the entire act of sacrifice. Strictly speaking, immolation refers to the destruction of the victim, even though it must have some reference to the offering of the victim as well. On the other hand, although oblation or offering alone does not suffice to confer victimhood, nonetheless, de la Taille says it's the central gift-oriented action of sacrifice. So if one looks to Old Testament evidence of sacrifices, both bloody and unbloody, it is the action of offering that unites them all. In these two actions of sacrifice in Old Testament examples, the immolation could actually be carried out by someone who was not a priest, but the oblation was always carried out by the priest, most often after the slain, but sometimes also prior to the immolation. The integrating element of sacrifice cannot be immolation because there is nothing in the destruction of the gift itself that signifies interior devotion or the dedication of the gift to God. So it's the liturgus, the priest, and his ritual action which transfers the gift or the victim to God. One of the ways that de la Taille develops this is through the scholastic image of the soul being the form of the body. So he says that oblation is the determining form of sacrifice, whereas immolation is the material element. So like oblation is the determining form of sacrifice, that's the soul of sacrifice. The immolation is the material element or the bodily matter of sacrifice. So that's basically what the third suggestion says. The gift-giving ritual of sacrifice is constituted by two acts, oblation and immolation. Both are important, but it's the oblation which determines the immolation as sacrificial. Okay. All right, let's go on to number 4, which is Dilettai's significant focus on the Last Supper. For him, the supper and the cross are conceived as a single sacrifice. It is at the Last Supper that Jesus offers himself as a victim to the Father, contrary to Luther, who said that Jesus doesn't offer anything at the Last Supper, but he just gives something, right, to us, to his disciples. Christ does so by way of bread and wine, which he declares to be his body and blood poured out for many. Here is his willing surrender of his life to the Father. Here is the new covenant and blood. The victim to be immolated is present and is offered, and thus the sacrifice has, properly speaking, begun, and it is consummated by the immolation and death on the cross. Dilettai spends a good deal of time in Mysterium Fidei demonstrating that his suggestion here, linking the Last Supper to the cross as a single sacrifice, does not go against the fathers of the Council of Trent. He shows us a good deal of the Acts of the Council, which shows that theologians there were in fact thinking in these terms, even if it wasn't clearly articulated in session 22 of the Council. I think Dilettai says something to the effect that the Council Fathers didn't want to muddy the waters in their response to Luther, and they just wanted to keep it more straightforward and simple. And under 4a, now the connection can be made to the ecclesial Mass sacrifice. At the Last Supper and at the Mass, there is a real offering of Christ's passion and death because the body and blood are present via the consecration. Right? So the oblation in the Mass, as in the Last Supper, is realis et praesens. It's real and it's present. The immolation is mystical or in sacramento. Okay, going on to the 5th point, the acceptance of the gift. Dilettai demonstrates that 4th century fathers in particular, right, understood the resurrection and the ascension as the consummation of the sacrifice in terms of its acceptance by God. That acceptance sanctifies the gift by its contact with the divine. In the Eucharist, that victim is then returned by God to the offerers, that they might be conjoined to the victim and thereby divinized by union with him. Let me go on to point 6. The Mass is a true sacrifice because of the identity of the victim offered, but a victim already immolated some 2,000 years ago. The Church can offer this, do this, only because God gives her the power to do so. So by a power derivative of the priesthood of Christ, the Church can offer the same sacrifice which Christ offered at the Last Supper, for it is the same victim present. Only now that victim is already immolated. It is the manner of offering, the modus oblationis, which mystically closes the gap whereby the Church's sacrifice and the supper cross sacrifice are one. The Church's offering is not a new personal act of Christ, although the power is his and he associates the ecclesial sacrifice to his own. So this is a new sacrifice by the Church, and it's both distinct and not distinct from Christ's sacrifice. That is to say, all the newness comes from this particular concrete historical action of the Church offering, even though all the power to offer is Christ's. There is a unity of the two sacrifices. The Church is subordinately participating in Christ's offering and sacrifice. So the unity of what is being offered is what secures the identity of the cross sacrifice. Point number 7, on the eternal and celestial victim. This is an important pillar in de la Taille's theory of sacrifice, and it is one that's caused some debate. It's one that Abbot Vonnier, for example, dismisses in his book. And here's the question, I think, which it is trying to deal with. With Jesus' death on the cross, doesn't his sacrifice thereby come to an end? Must we not say that there is no sacrifice in heaven? Considering sacrifice in an active sense, yes, right? Christ's sacrifice is indeed completed. But de la Taille says that a certain passive sacrifice remains, in that Jesus is now the eternally accepted victim. He is in heaven in the quality of a gift, eternally accepted and kept by God. Jesus is continually exhibiting himself in his humanity as that victim who suffered for the sins of the world. Right? His wounds, of course, remain. So the resurrection and ascension manifests the eternal acceptance of Christ's sacrifice. The eternal victim is in heaven in the quality of a gift, once offered, accepted, kept forever by God, the Lamb once slain who lives forever. And it's the eternity of the victim that assures that the ecclesial gift is the gift offered by Jesus at the Last Supper. Okay, finally, point number 8. And this also deals with an interesting question. What makes Mass at noon on Monday efficaciously any different than Mass at noon, let's say, on Tuesday? Or is there any difference? Answering the question demands that we gather the threads of de la Taille's notion of sacrifice that we've been explicating, and particularly sacrifice belonging to the category of gift. So de la Taille wants to say this: every offering of sacrifice, including the churches, is a sign of the interior devotion that must accompany an acceptable sacrifice. On the basis of what is offered, every Mass sacrifice is equally, infinitely, and abundantly fruitful. However, the fruits of the sacrifice are limited and restricted by the offerers, that is, by the measure of their affect in offering the gift. The participation of the faithful in the offering of the sacrifice is crucial, in a consideration of the fruits of every Mass. The baptized have the obligation and are disposed to offering the ecclesial sacrifice, but how involved are they, every Mass? Are they offering themselves in latria to God? Is there a promise of surrender at the altar? All of this can indeed limit or determine the always abundant fruits that flow generously from the sacrificial fountain. And I'm going to be talking more about baptism in a little while, so I'll save that for later. All right. Is this way of construing sacrifice still valuable? I think so. I hope so. De la Taille's contribution, particularly in carefully enumerating the two aspects of oblation and immolation, along with his focus on the Last Supper, I think remain illuminating for understanding the Mass sacrifice. His theory offers, I think, a caution also about overly immolational positions that still are being articulated about Eucharistic sacrifice. And the last point, number 8, which I enumerated about the offering of the baptized at Mass, I think also helps to deter or to ward off any temptations toward clericalism, which I fear sometimes emerges on blog sites that I've looked at that are keen for the usus antiquior. Not all of them, but some of them. I still consider de la Taille's work on sacrifices bridging a gap between some rather more misguided post-Vatican II liturgical thought which all but sanitizes or idealizes sacrifice as simply ethical action, and articulations of the Mass of Sacrifice, which all but overlook the importance of the theology of an offering church. So with those 8 points, I've essentially taken you through the first 2 volumes of de la Taille's work. The first volume on Christ's sacrifice and the second volume on the ecclesial sacrifice. De la Taille's part 3, or the third book, is on the sacrament, in which he focuses on a number of different questions concerning the sacramental reception of the Eucharist, the grace of the Eucharist, Christ's grace, the relationship of the other sacraments to the Eucharist, transubstantiation, and a number of other topics. I go on in my own book to present de la Taille's theology on the effects of sacramental reception of the Eucharist, the grace of union and divinization, and then I treat some of his rich thought on the grace of Christ, as well as his treatment of prayer and the spirituality of the baptized. For the sake of this presentation, however, and looking to the ongoing value of his thought, I'm going to focus briefly now on his treatment of the Eucharistic grace of union and his baptismal liturgical spirituality. My reflections here have been partly engendered by what the pandemic has highlighted for me about the baptized faithful and our need both for the flesh of Christ to nourish and excite desire, and the need for us to ritually offer the sacrifice in order to continue maturing spiritually. Okay, so part 3 on the Eucharistic grace of union. The divinizing union of the sacraments and the desire for the flesh of the victim, right? On this topic of Eucharistic grace, de la Taille doesn't necessarily say anything particularly new, but his presentation of the tradition is richly instructive, as he always has an eye, so to speak, on sacrificial oblation. De la Taille's discussion of the sanctifying grace of the Eucharist is perhaps my favorite part of the third volume. He weaves together citations from Scripture and the early fathers in such an impressive way that I've never read anything that has excited as much my own desire to receive the Eucharist and to receive that grace which flows from the sacrificial banquet. His work is both systematic and mystagogic, as he takes one more deeply into the divinizing effects of receiving the sacrament. He relies a good deal in this section on the work of Hilary of Poitiers and on the Trinity, and also Cyril of Alexandria, and you're probably going to hear that as we go forward. He elucidates the dynamic of the exchange of flesh, which occurs in the Eucharistic reception. The Eucharistic flesh of Christ, now glorified, yet not without its humanity, takes up the flesh of the believer in order to communicate its divine life. This is a union that is immediate and permanent, so long as the believer clings to the life of Christ, clings to the vine, to use the Johannine image. In the Eucharistic grace of union, I'm quoting here, the Lord assumes to his very self those who receive that divinizing life into themselves with a full and avid heart. Note in those last words what's important to de la Taille in terms of the reception: an eager heart, a will on fire with a desire for Christ and his life. So that just as volition and devotio are central to the offering of the sacrifice, our willing self-offering, which imitates Christ's voluntary offering of himself at the Last Supper, so too the movement of the will is central in receiving Christ in the mystical supper. In the Eucharist, there is an exchange of flesh, commercium carnis, which allows a vivifying life to flow into our mortal flesh, already allowing that flesh a participation in resurrection life. From the sacrificial banquet table, union is effected also to all the members of the body of Christ. It is impossible to be united to Christ the head and not also to the body of the whole church. In addressing the shared divine life of the ecclesial body, de la Taille does not hesitate to speak of the union between the church and Christ in terms of Genesis 2, the union proclaimed between male and female, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He favors this marital image, which is also Pauline, as aptly expressive of the intimacy and permanence of Eucharistic unity to Christ. In partaking of Christ's flesh, the church becomes the body of Christ, just as it is written, let the two become as one flesh. How does one come to love the fellow members of Christ's body? De la Taille writes that it depends both upon our desire for Christ's flesh and the caritas, the love that flows into the soul from our reception of that body. For the Eucharistic flesh and blood affects a kind of circumcessio between the members of Christ's body. The theological gift of love is actualized and increased within us so that it is Christ's very love which flows from you to your brother and to your sister. And I think here, just to parenthetically say this, one can certainly begin to sympathize with families forced into close quarters incessantly during the time of COVID quarantine, struggling to want to love one another, and really, right, in desperate need of the sacrament, which gives the capacity to love. When considering the relationship between the grace of the Eucharist and the graces of the other sacraments, de la Taille makes it clear that all other graces depend upon the Eucharist, the grace of the Redeemer. In the end, he writes, every desire for grace is a desire towards and for the Eucharistic banquet, a desire for union ad Christum. I want to repeat here a statement that reveals the principle of reciprocal priority and causality, which is a mark of de la Taille's theology of sacramental grace. And I think this quote is on the handout, on the outline there. For the Eucharist itself begets both the desire, which disposes one toward grace, and the grace from which desire proceeds. The Eucharist is essential then for the life of desire, for life oriented to and open to grace. So after hearing briefly de la Taille on the effects of the Eucharist, let's pause here a minute to reflect particularly on the experience of being deprived of the Eucharist for such a long stretch of time. It was 74 days for me. The divinizing and intimacy of union with Christ, I think, came home to many of us with a new force in the experience of deprivation during the pandemic. And I think de la Taille helps us to theologically articulate the kind of perishing that many faithful felt during that time. In a similar way, if we understand with de la Taille that the reception of the Eucharist, even our very first reception of it, if we understand that there's a permanent grace of union established in the soul, he also clarifies that the very desire to receive needs to be inflamed by the actual grace of receiving the Eucharistic banquet. And in Book 3, he devotes a good deal of space to presenting reasons for the necessity of frequent reception of the Eucharist. One of those is the reality that Christ instituted this august sacrament in the forms of daily common bread, right, and wine, in order to direct our attention and excite our desire for frequent reception. So the believer needs the reception of the divinizing gift in order to remain in a state of clinging tightly to the life of the vine. Incorporation to Christ, as well as a living, loving communion with the church, slips, that's his word, slips when the believer does not receive with sacramental frequency. when a number of writers at the beginning of church closings were sort of prognosticating that church attendance would be far diminished at the end of the pandemic, my immediate reaction was that this was a bit alarmist and pessimistic. But now, having reread some of Taille and the material for this webinar, perhaps, right, there are some good theological reasons for this anxiety, right? That long stretch of time, even simply without receiving the Eucharist. To be sure, one can speak of the efficacy of spiritual communion, and Taille believes that the grace of the sacrament can be received ex voto by desire. But at some point in our enfleshed, incarnate life as baptized Christians, that spiritual communion needs to be made real by actual receiving. As the churches did reopen, I suspect Catholics came to understand much more vitally and experientially the difference between, right, spiritual and sacramental communion. Okay, the last point on baptism and oblation. Baptism is really the sacramental hinge of Taille's integrated theory of Eucharistic sacrifice. So it warrants, I think, attention. He treats this sacrament at length in Book 3. If he writes, as he does, that every sacramental grace hangs upon a desire for the Eucharist of the sacrificed lamb, be it a healing, elevating, unitive grace, this dynamic of desire and dependence is especially and most illustriously true of the ordering of baptism to the Eucharist. So let me unpack briefly his theology of baptism as it relates to the Eucharist. He presents a vision of this relationship as sort of two intersecting axes. Baptism aligns with the following: with mortification and purification of desires through ascetic prayer and practices. Baptism aligns with the cross and with the offering of sacrifice. On the other axis, he positions life, grace, union, peace, purified love, all under the fruits of the Eucharistic banquet. And what connects these two lines of spiritual realities is desire, is the movement of the will's affection. Taille argues that no one undergoes baptism, no one enters the way of ascetic prayer or offers sacrifice apart from a desire for the Eucharist and its divinizing union to God. For Taille, baptism is a mystical death through which the new believer is immolated with Christ and commits him or herself to a lifelong process of spiritual mortification, or ascesis. That spiritual progress is intimately related to the liturgical offering of sacrifice at the Mass. And let me try to spell this out by looking, as Taille does, at the signifying power of baptism itself. Baptism primarily, per saipsum, he says, through itself, signifies death. The believer is buried in the floodwaters of baptism, dies, and is entombed with Christ. The reception of Eucharist, on the other hand, primarily signifies, per saipsum, incorporation into the vital and living body of Christ. What Taille underscores is that in baptism, incorporation into the vital and living body of Christ, one is conformed to a death that is intrinsically ordered to life and the desire for life. Baptism, like the Lord's own sacrificial Passover, is ordered to life. And herein he identifies an analogy to the offering of sacrifice at Mass. This ordering of death to life is also clear, he says, in the act of offering sacrifice. For the oblation marks the beginning of reception, that is, the consummated victim returned to the worshiper bestowing heavenly gifts. Thus, baptism and sacrificial oblation are both signs of death, but they are oriented to life and the divinizing fruits of the Eucharist. De la Taille pushes this reality of a double significance of baptism a little bit further. The double significance being primarily toward death, but also indirectly toward life. By examining the causal efficacy of the sacrament of baptism, can we say that baptism causes both death and life? To be sure, there's nothing surprising about the suggestion that baptism, in fact, occasions death, for burial is clearly represented in the sacrament. But how does baptism, through an indirect sign, also affect new life? De la Taille's answer to this question takes us into the heart of his theology of desire. Baptism can cause life because baptism desires the life of the Eucharistic banquet, desires that vivification which comes from a participation in the Paschal victim. Now, to desire that life, de la Taille says, is already to possess it in some measure. There is no death without the desire for life, and there is no desire for life which entirely lacks life. So if the believer is taking on death in baptism, in the desire to receive the life of the Eucharist, then Christ is already a part of that movement to life as the end of that hunger. And I'm quoting him here. He says, Christ is not absent to those who fittingly move towards Christ. How are we doing on time? All right,
we're at about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to make a point about 1 Peter 3:21 real quickly, because de la Taille spends a lot of time interpreting this in an effort to secure his connection between baptismal death and sacrificial offering. He writes that baptismal death is endured so that one might live, and this is quoting 1 Peter 3 here, not for the desires of men, but for the will of God, living unto God according to justice and with a good conscience. These verses from 1 Peter suggest the sacramental rite by which we are conjoined to Christ's passion, baptism, is the petition for and the longing for a life of pure desire before God, already partially fulfilled in the offering of sacrifice, in which we unite our still being purified desire with the pure desire of Christ. He writes, it is not surprising that our death thus offered in the death of Christ is a desire for life, because every sacrificial offering is a prayer for divine consummation, and the consummation of an acceptable gift is life in the presence of God. Powerfully then, baptismal death is aimed at the offering and immolation of ungodly desire, so that the desire for life with God may be primary and may be realized. I want to allow some time for questions, so I want to jump to what he has to say about baptismal character. He believes, I'll just summarize this real quickly, that the res et sacramentum of baptism is the imprinting of the character of Christ's sacerdotal nature onto the soul of the one baptized, so that the one baptized is already, right, oriented to the offering of sacrifice. And he writes that this baptismal character indicates in us an interior immolation to God, in terms of an immolation of the life of sin, of the flesh, and of the world, in order that we might live unto God through grace. And the baptized Christian, right, depends on the priest and his offering of the ecclesial sacrifice to give exterior expression to that desire and that baptismal desire to offer sacrifice. He does say that there are moments at the Mass where the community expresses this openly, in the dialogue, in the amen, in the kiss of peace are all manifestations of the votum, the desire of the offerers, and certainly the one who provides for the Mass in terms of a stipend very practically expresses this desire. But the baptized rely right upon the offering of the priest to make that clear. So let me close by saying a couple things. Baptism radically commits the believer to a lifelong battle against disordered desire and accepts ongoing mortification of their desires in becoming baptized and in imitating the death of Christ. And Taille writes that in the very activity of ecclesial offering, the worshiper's desire encounters the sharp knife, and those are his words, of being adjoined to the perfect love of the priest and victim, which gift attains to the bosom of the Father. So just briefly, why do I think all of this matters and matters greatly? Perhaps far too obviously to begin with, baptism in general, I think, is an underappreciated and forgotten sacrament, even though we could say it was elevated at the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium. But Taille reminds us that our whole spiritual life is rooted in it, and that it inevitably orders our life to the Eucharistic sacrifice. Secondly, my students, and I think many in the pews, struggle to articulate the difference between a Mass and a communion service. Yes, they recognize that Father's not there at a communion service, and but they can still receive the Eucharist. I don't think they fully understand that they and the whole Church have something important, essential to do besides listening to the readings and singing some hymns before the reception of communion. So I like Taille's tight connection between baptism and sacrificial offering. It makes clear, that all are called to participate in this sacrificial offering. And he really goes on to suggest that Eucharistic union to Christ can't be rightly desired, without the oblation of sacrifice. So the dynamic of offering the gift and offering oneself, needs to be there, or it's as if we're hobbling along on a single liturgical and baptismal foot. So I've tried to challenge my students to ask themselves what's incomplete about a communion service, or what's incomplete about, they've told me stories about priests giving them communion in the parking lots in their cars during COVID. So I've asked them to consider what's incomplete about that, and to ask themselves whether or not this is metaphorically what some worshipers might be doing under normal circumstances, because not really engaging their role in the offering of the sacrifice. I think I'll stop there, except just to say that rereading Taille made clear to me the sort of pain that I felt, of not being able to offer that sacrifice, for such a long time. Okay. Thank you, all of you, for listening for so long, and please, in the time we have left, I take questions or comments.
Michon, would you mind unsharing your screen?
Yes, I'll do that right now. That I can do.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks. Hi.
Michon, I apologize. I was delayed in getting online for the lecture. I had an internet connection difficulty, but I really appreciated everything that you offered. And as I was listening to you, I thought, how do I take this and allow it to be translated into an accessible way for the person, not only who is at home watching the Mass via live stream, but even the person in the pew and also for the priest celebrating, who is now tolerant of both situations, almost as if they're.
Yeah.
This is a major theological and liturgical issue that we're dealing with. What you said was so crystal clear and arrives from the tradition, but it is so absent from the popular mind, both on both sides of the sanctuary. Do you have a practical idea for us?
I'm afraid I always put it back on the preaching, the preachers to communicate this right in an accessible way. Yeah, I don't really have a practical suggestion. I mean, except to raise the question and to help people understand what it was and what's so disturbing and about not being able to be present, right? Because I skipped over some parts about baptism also being the beginning of an espousal relationship to Christ, and right that those promises, right, have to be renewed in the act of sacrifice at a physical altar, right, in a church, right, and it can't happen. It just can't happen virtually. I'm convinced of that.
I know that. It's the weakness in really understanding our privilege to participate in the Eucharistic prayer. And this overemphasis on the reception of communion, like bypassing the Eucharistic prayer for communion. And we saw that during the pandemic. What was most important was that people receive communion, not that they be united with the Eucharistic offering.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe someone else present can suggest something more practical. But somehow once the people are back, right, some sort of preaching, right, about right, the importance of their participation in the offering as so intimately connected to the baptism, those baptismal waters, right, in which they were submerged. I think one of the other points that I sort of left off was, we talk about confirmation as being that sacrament or that moment in the life of a young adult when they can finally claim their baptism and make it their own. And I want to suggest that no, right? Every Eucharist that you attend is you claiming and making real that baptism that happened to you as an infant. So some sort of education, right, for young people as well would be really important.
Thank you.
Dr. Fistigi has a question, and then Dr. Eschenauer.
Well, thank you, Michon, for your very illuminating
Thank you.
talk. And this is something that relates to what you said, but also has a wider context. It has to do with how we participate by uniting our sufferings to those of Christ. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of what is said in Sacrosanctum Concilium, really a quote, but for the liturgy through which the work of our redemption is accomplished, exercetur, worked out. So the sacrifice occurred once on Calvary. Now it's represented, as Trent says, at every Mass. The sacrifice is the same, which Delatai, of course, accepts. But it's being worked out now when we unite our sufferings, not only in the Mass, but to Christ the victim,
right.
The Passion. And it has even St. John Paul II twice invited the sick to unite their sufferings to those of Christ. And then he said, you could be co-redeemers of humanity, co-redeemers with Christ. And of course, he wasn't afraid to use this 6 times in regard to the Blessed Mother, correndentrice, in Italian. I know if you put it on the level of equality, of course, it's unacceptable, as Pope Francis has said. But all of us, somehow we unite in a congruous manner our sufferings. So how does Delatai understand first the notion of chronology, that the work of redemption is still being accomplished, or to quote Pascal, Jesus will be in agony until the end of the world. I don't know. And two popes have quoted that passage, Pope Benedict XVI and John Paul II. So I guess the question is, how do we understand, or Delatai understand, this notion of the ongoing working out of the work of redemption?
Well, yeah, I think this is one of his major major counsels for us in terms of participating more fully. That is to say, he does say, that the more fully every baptized person places themselves on that altar. I mean, this morning for me, it was my fear in giving this presentation, but one's suffering, one's sickness, the more that happens, the more efficacious the offering of the victim is, not just for oneself, but for the whole world. So yes, he does have this sense that, our participation matters in the redemption of the world, definitely, And one of the very last elucidations in Mysterium Fidei, I don't know if you've been through the whole thing, but is on Mary as co-redemptress, and he actually welcomes that to some extent. So,
okay. Well, thank you. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Thank you so much. It was so enlightening. But I couldn't help but think, and I've been saying this throughout the whole pandemic in general about people. Everybody's focused on what they've lost and what they can't do. And I've been saying it to my young adult children, that we don't have a sense of sacrifice in our ordinary life. So I think in relationship with what Michon said, when people come back, we need to help them to understand and make these connections of sacrifice in ordinary life so they can better understand what they are missing and what they need to be participating in that sacrifice. And also just, I think that's so important. And I'm a pastoral, practical theologian, so I'm always trying to make connections.
Good.
And I think that's related to what Father Gill was asking. But also, I appreciate so much the comment you made about confirmation. I teach a course at our seminary on confirmation, and I make that point all the time. That the summit and source is the Eucharist. But because of the order of our sacraments of initiation for those baptized at infancy, it looks like confirmation. So thank you for that. That really affirmed for me. But my main point is that idea of sacrifice in our ordinary life. We need to help people with that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, I agree. Delatai has a separate essay that he gave at a Eucharistic Congress. Excuse me, I can't remember which Eucharistic Congress it was, but where he much more fully integrates our daily mortifications, our the denial that we have of some of the things that we here in the pandemic that we are used to doing but have been taken away from us. The more we place those at the altar, with the victim of sacrifice, the more fruitful that's going to be, for everyone, in the body of Christ.
Yes, thank you so much.
And he says, I think one of the lines is specifically, he says, it gives sincerity to the Eucharist when we do that, our Eucharistic offerings are more sincere when our whole life, our whole daily spiritual life is brought to the altar.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. It's beautiful.
Michon, Father Sean Tunick here from Kansas City.
Okay.
Question for you regarding the notion of the Orate Fratres and the sacrifice, which is Meum et Vestra, mine and yours. would De La Taille see the oblation? Is it both offering? Are there two offerings, two oblations going on? I suppose the offering of the priest and the offering of the people, and do both offer the immolated victim Christ, or is it only the priest that is the liturgos, as you say, who is ritually offering the immolated Christ as an oblation? Do the people join in offering the immolated Christ? And if so, how? What is their participatory role, I guess, in the Eucharistic prayer?
I can't remember ever De La Taille suggesting that there are two offerings happening, right? But rather that the priest is the one handing over the gift, right? That the people in their will and affect have already, placed in his hands. But it's one movement for De La Taille. It's not. He never makes any sort of distinction about, there's one offering here and then there's another offering of the priest.
Would the people join then in making that offering via the spoken Eucharistic prayer? Is that the moment in which the people join in offering that oblation, or is that by some other way that
No, that's certainly a part of it. Yes, right. They're they are listening, right, and they are dependent upon the priest to offer that. When De La Taille thinks about when that victim becomes present, he thinks it becomes present at the words of consecration, which of course, only the priest enunciates. But the whole church is always, there isn't just some moment that the church is not in, or should be engaged, in the offering. It's not as if they, up until that point, and then they stop, and the rest of the priests, or not until the final doxology when the gifts are lifted up. It's all De La Taille understands it as all unfolding the offering of the gift.
I could just add, Father, the way Michon is answering that question is exactly the way the current general instruction describes the Eucharistic prayer. In number 78, the priest calls upon the people to lift up their hearts towards the Lord in prayer and thanksgiving. He associates the people with himself in the prayer as the sacrifice takes place. There's a real
Good, thank you.
offering that becomes the one offering of Christ. This type of clear theology concerning sacrifice really is just absent across the board today, both on the part of the priest and the baptized, and it's not given the attention that it needs. And you would hope that the pandemic can certainly bring it forward, but that's part of our work.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions at this point?
Michon,
Mary Catherine?
yeah, Michon, this is kind of a practical question, but I wonder if you can help me with it. I know over the course of the pandemic, when parishes have decided to live stream their masses, I've seen over and over again, to my concern, that pastors, and these are very good priests I know, say, we invite you to participate in the mass via live stream, and they'll use the word participate. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. I've gone back and forth a little bit, but I know you just said sort of the nuptial quality of our baptism and the renewal really of those baptismal vows at the Eucharist, and it must needs be a physical presence on the part of the baptized. Do you think, in the sense that the entire church is offering the Mass, and that there is a kind of spiritual presence of the universal church, would you say we could use that word participate, or is there another way to better describe what we're doing when we tune in, so to speak, via live stream?
I don't want to say that I think it's absolutely impossible for real participation to happen virtually. It's absolutely impossible for me, right? But I just don't want to say that across the board. Right, if the Mass is about the offering of this gift, it's something that, first of all, cannot be done alone. Without right, the church, right, with you, it maybe some people have the capacity to stretch their religious and ritual imaginations to imagine themselves there, right, in a church, in the sacred building, and with others, and in front of the altar. I absolutely was incapable of doing it. I wouldn't call it participating in the Mass. Live stream Masses have been important to me for the liturgy of the Word and to listen, right, and to hear the Word. But when it comes to the liturgy of the Eucharist, I never got through it. I just could not. I just couldn't. It just seemed absolutely wrong. Yeah. So I don't know what word participate. I mean, you view it, you hear it, you view it. Is it a participation? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, certainly in terms of fulfillment of the obligation, physical presence is required, right? So in so much as our obligation is fulfilled by a participation in Mass, it's not a fulfillment of that obligation, right? But, well, anyway, thank you.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should bring our afternoon conference to a close. Michon, I want to thank you very much. And I also want to apologize to you and everyone else again that I was delayed at the beginning. I'm sorry about that. It was just an internet episode. But anyhow, this was really wonderful. And we thank you so very much for making this lecture available to us. And it was recorded, and so it will be on the website of the Society so many other people can take advantage of it. I want to let you know, and we'll also let the membership and others know, that we have one more lecture in this spring lecture series, and that is going to be Father Daniel Cardot, who is with us today. He will be speaking on Wednesday, May 19th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And his topic, Suspecting Suspicion, what we can know of the early Eucharist. It certainly is a wonderful follow-up to your words to us today, Michon. So we look forward to all of you joining us in May. And Father Daniel, it's good to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
God bless
A blessed Easter to all of you.
you too. Happy Easter.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michon.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks, Michon.
All right. Thanks, guys.